Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Practice of Pastoral Care, Revised and Expanded Edition, A Postmodern Approach, by Carrie Doehring. Narrated by Nan Mcnamara. Ubi caritas et amor, Deus ibi est. Where charity and love are, there is God. 9th century Latin chant based on 1 John chapter 4, verse 16, traditionally sung during the foot washing that is part of the Maundy Thursday service. Introducing an intercultural approach. The year was 1978. I was among the first dozen women ordained in the Presbyterian Church in Canada when I began ministry in 2 rural Presbyterian congregations in Ontario. Being petite and shy, I looked younger than my 24 years. My theological education at McGill University had been academically rigorous, but less effective in the arts of ministry. What saved me was my passion for stories and my love of literature. Raised within a family of stoical introverts, I was intensely curious about the emotional inner workings of relationships and families. The first adult novel I read as a teenager, The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck, seemed to infuse vivid emotional colors into the black and white of my emotionally suppressed Germanic American family upbringing. Vigorously experiencing the drama of human life through literature was safe and deeply engrossing. During theological studies, my favorite author was Iris Murdoch. Her novels vividly portrayed how people with the best intentions became tragically entangled in each other's lives because of limited self-knowledge and unconscious needs. Murdoch's novels helped me listen for the dramas beneath the seemingly placid surface of my parishioners' lives. I began my ministry with a commitment to visit each family with regular follow-up visits to those in need. I'm guessing that it was my keen interest in their stories that led many of them to trust me. Though I was anxious about these visits, I soon began to trust the process of stepping into their narrative worlds and following their lead in ways similar to how I followed the storyline of a novel. I soon discovered that pastoral care was not just a matter of listening to these unfolding stories. It was also about creating meaning. 3 months into my ministry, a young father in my congregation escaped from a locked psychiatric ward, returned home, and ended his life. His parents and widow told me stories of their helplessness in the face of his intractable depression. Out of these stories, we began to craft a metaphor of his despair as a terrible illness, a sort of recurring cancer that took over his soul. When he was in the depths of this seemingly inescapable despair, suicide presented itself as the only way out. In recalling how I functioned in the early days of my ministry, I see how my love of novels formed me as a spiritual caregiver. I entered into the stories people told me about the tragic dimensions of their lives. Storytelling was like a vessel that carried us through turbulent waters. I trusted the process of storytelling and sharing. The process of piecing together stories helped people author their lives. For example, this family and I found a metaphor that helped them externalize the shame associated with mental illness and suicide, releasing them from fears of being judged and shunned, and empowering them with a sense of agency in reaching out to parents like themselves. This metaphor of intractable depression as an illness became the basis for my funeral address. This metaphor shaped a public theology of his death that helped his family talk openly about feeling like they had not done enough. This public theology centered on God's compassion toward those afflicted with mental illness and the compassionate ways this family could experience and live with their loss. They drew upon this public theology to tell their story and help others. It is easy to imagine the private theology of shame that could have easily shaped their memories of this young man. The public theology of compassion emerged out of my pastoral conversations with them and was articulated and communally experienced in the funeral address and service. Pastoral care, then, was not only about listening, it was also about co-creating meanings arising from their experience of God's compassion. Storytelling as the heart of pastoral care. My early experience of pastoral care engaged the arts of listening, storytelling, and story crafting. Just as drama, literature, and film use images, metaphors, and symbols artistically to convey what is unique yet also universal about life and death, storytelling in pastoral care often searches for ways to connect with God, humanity, and creation amidst pain, suffering, and the everyday trials of life. There are stories, for example, about a loved one's last breath, the betrayal of infidelity, or battles with addiction. Stories allow people to lament with each other, express anger, and question all they know about life, without imposing meanings prematurely. In the process of telling stories, people become authors, instinctively finding a story's beginning and climax and imagining various endings. When pastoral care is experienced as narrative, it becomes more relational and communal. A narrative approach is first and foremost about trust. The more people trust pastoral caregivers, the more they will entrust them with the bits and pieces of their stories, especially the undigested emotional reiterations of trauma. They will invite us into the chaos of trauma or the narrative loops of obsessive ruminations. They will ask us to play with the narratives and immerse ourselves in their sea of stories. This trust allows us, together, to begin to find meanings that keep their heads above the water, floating instead of struggling and sinking. A narrative approach is, second, about finding meanings and practices formed in the crucible of stress, suffering, and joy, as well as the ordinary tedium and goodness of life. Relational trust opens up a space for co-creating meanings that make emotional and spiritual sense within the narrative context of personal and communal life. Being oriented to narrative, pastoral caregivers are more likely to follow the meanings that emerge as the story unfolds. Theological reflection becomes collaborative and inductive. This inductive approach to meaning-making can be contrasted with deductive approaches that apply abstract theological doctrines to the practice of care. Sometimes well-meaning pastoral caregivers move prematurely to making sense of a care seeker's story by deductively applying theological themes that are important to them. An inductive approach makes room for theological meanings to emerge from the care seeker's story. Narrative pastoral care is about contextual, provisional meanings grounded in the particularity of personal, family, and communal stories. Third, a narrative approach is about assessment, comparing theological meanings that emerge from care conversations with historical, biblical, sacred, textual, and global theologies. There is a timely role for connecting personal meanings with historical theologies and worldviews that have withstood the test of time or influential contemporary theologies, worldviews that incorporate emergent ways of understanding self, culture, creation, and God, the sacred or transcendent. Referenced prematurely or deductively, historical and contemporary theologies will close down emotional and spiritual struggles at the boundaries of the known and unknown. Such struggles often de-center care seekers because their suffering calls into question ultimate beliefs and sacred values. A compassionate and respectful care relationship can provide a trustworthy space for exploring new meanings. Pastoral caregivers need to be able to draw upon their theological education and training to think biblically, historically, and comparatively about these contextual theologies. In making connections between emergent meanings and public theologies, they might consider the pros and cons of referencing public theologies of suffering that have been tested over various historical and cultural contexts. For example, a morally oriented biblical or historical theology focused on individual responsibility might be life-giving when care seekers are ready to take responsibility for suffering they caused by abusing addictive substances. This same moral theology might, on the other hand, be more life-limiting for care seekers who believe that suffering results wholly from their own failings. For these people, a theology for the sinned against might be more life-giving. Pastoral caregivers bring theological, cultural, and psychological expertise to evaluating personal and public theologies in order to account for suffering in complex, systemic, and interdisciplinary ways. The compassionate art of intercultural care. The process of care begins when caregivers enter into the care seeker's story-making with a sense of wonder, awe, and humility, opening themselves up to the mystery of life narratives. Narratives, like religious symbols, communicate mystery by pointing beyond themselves to ineffable dimensions of human life that cannot be fully apprehended or articulated. Mystery is a term that is easily misunderstood for obscure, secret, or divinely revealed meanings, or for puzzles that can be neatly solved. Mystery in a religious or spiritual sense encompasses the territory of the sacred, a broad term for ultimate beliefs and core values, along with personal and communal spiritual practices like prayer and meditation. Compassion plays a vital role in the process of pastoral care. Care seekers often bring narratives of pain. Entering into the mystery of another's pain requires compassion. In a literal sense, compassion as compassio, caregivers suffer with care seekers. Compassion, which requires the capacities for emotional intelligence and empathy, entails the discipline of being able to surrender to and being moved by the emotional experiences and needs of the other. Compassion also requires ongoing spiritual practices that connect caregivers emotionally and spiritually with the goodness of life. Regular spiritual practices foster compassion towards self and others, changing how caregivers react to vicarious experiences of another's pain. They are less likely to get stuck in empathic distress, in which emotions like fear and anger become life-limiting, making caregivers want to withdraw. Spiritual practices make the web of compassion holding all humanity emotionally real. The embodied experience of self-compassion predisposes caregivers to respond to another's pain with life-giving feelings like love and concern, and desires to help. The embodied experience of compassion reveals the healing power of compassion. Beliefs about compassion and values about interconnected caring can in turn foster a theology of compassion as a persisting way of interpreting and responding to the world. Caregivers embody the kindness and compassion of humanity and God in theistic religious traditions when they show through their body language, emotional and spiritual presence, and words that they both suffer with and want to help those in pain. Compassion that suffers with and reaches out is relational. Theologically, compassion can be understood as a life force throughout interconnected relational webs that sustains those in pain, persons, families, communities, and all of creation. Both caregiver and careseeker are held within these caring networks that spread out far beyond them. Compassion opens people up to the mystery of suffering and helps them integrate suffering into their life narratives in sustaining and creative ways. Compassion has a long history in many religions of the world. In the Abrahamic traditions, the covenant between God and humanity is the deep grammar of a compassionate web of life. This covenant is enacted in promises Jewish and Christian people make in baptisms, confirmations, bar and bat mitzvahs, weddings, and ordinations. The study of compassion throughout the history of one's tradition can nurture the religious faith of caregivers, making compassionate love a tangible emotional and spiritual experience. Pastoral theologian Ryan Lamoth, for example, explores a parable found in the Gospel of Thomas to argue for pastoral leaders who are radically compassionate in that they have the courage to be emotionally and spiritually open to the pain of strangers and enemies who may hold truths and values that seem foreign and even threatening. Ongoing theological study can reveal new ways for caregivers to experience, understand, and embody what compassion means in their religious tradition. Integrating emotionally felt beliefs about compassion into one's spiritual practices will make one more likely to experience a sense of solidarity when one reaches out to help those in pain. The process of stepping respectfully and compassionately into another's narrative world can be described with the metaphor of hospitality. We must embody compassionate respect as we step over the threshold and enter into another's religious or spiritual world, not knowing when we will encounter sacred images, meanings, and places within the narrative worlds of care seekers. The term religious world was coined by William Payton in his comparative study of religion. It describes the ongoing relational process that uses language and practice to organize the world in terms of what is deemed sacred. When care seekers trust caregivers to respect the mystery of what is sacred for them, then new ways of seeing and experiencing the sacred may emerge. The experience of hospitality changes both care seekers and caregivers, as together they begin to co-create new meanings and wisdom out of the intermingling and braiding of the care seekers' and caregivers' stories, spoken and unspoken. While values and beliefs related to hospitality have a long history within many religious traditions, I am using the metaphor of hospitality in a more reciprocal way to describe how the roles of host and guest alternate, and all parties are inevitably changed through experiences of hospitality. The mingling of the care seekers' and caregivers' narrative worlds generates an intersubjective space for meaning-making. Intersubjectivity is an abstract term whose dryness belies the wonder of this inherently relational process of making meaning. Religion itself can be understood as a web not of meanings but of relationships between heaven and earth. For example, when we read a novel or watch a film, we enter into an intersubjective space with the work of art. Our stories commune with the elements of a film or novel. We may become temporarily lost as though in a hall of mirrors where we see ourselves reflected in the twists and turns of the plots. A memorable film or novel becomes part of our story. This intersubjective intermingling of stories is illustrated in a recent conversation I had with a young man about the pleasures of listening to audiobooks. The other day he told me he drove through the Park Hill neighborhood of Denver, where he had delivered pizzas while in college. The best part of the job was listening to the latest Harry Potter novel while driving. I couldn't wait to hand over the pizza and get back to my car for the next installment, he recalled. He now associates certain areas of Park Hill with climactic moments in Harry Potter's battles with Lord Voldemort. At one intersection in particular, he thinks that's where Harry was almost killed. The novel was woven into the young man's life chapter of delivering pizzas. The high points of his listening are indelibly associated with geographic cues. Now certain sights, sounds, and smells trigger parts of Harry Potter's story that have merged into his own story. Listening to him, I was reminded of the novels I read as a teenager. Those books opened up a quality of life I knew was there, but didn't directly experience in my family, school, or social life. Many of my peers in the late 1960s got high on drugs, but I felt too anxious to seek out such mind-altering experiences. As with this young man, my highs came from novels, some of which I remember better than my daily routines. I recalled my teenage experience of novels as I wondered whether this young man experienced a high in listening to Harry Potter's adventures. Perhaps the novel heightened and satisfied a latent longing for ultimate meanings in his mundane but necessary job. We both experienced the craft of novelists, and in his case the artistry of the actor dramatizing the story, because these fictional worlds brought out ultimate, perhaps spiritual, dimensions of our ordinary lives. In turn, we made them our own, using their artistry to embroider our lives, like the dramatic storyline in the Harry Potter novel recalled at a particular street corner. When we enter into care seekers' stories, we may experience a similar interweaving of their story with ours. Together, we elaborate and embroider the care seeker's story, and to a certain extent our own stories, which become a resource for care. Reflect on an enlightening conversation you had with someone who helped you in the midst of a crisis. It might seem as though the insights you gained came from one of you, from either you or your conversation partner. I am suggesting that both of you contributed to these insights. They were co-created out of a trusting and respectful caregiving relationship. As caregivers, we are not only co-creators of portions of care seekers' stories, we also influence and shape aspects of their religious world, such as their core values, ultimate beliefs, and spiritual practices. Our formative role in care seekers' meaning-making and spiritual lives makes us responsible for our stuff, aspects of our stories, religious worlds that become engaged with their story-making, as well as other horizons of meaning that frame our understanding. I use the term intercultural to describe pastoral and spiritual care as a co-creative process of intermingling stories and lives. This generative process changes care seekers and caregivers, as well as their relationships, families, communities, cultures, and even, as I believe, God. As these interconnected systems change, the ripple effects continue, moving back and forth. In other words, change is not unidirectional from our inner worlds out to relationships, families, communities, and beyond. The preposition inter, in the term intercultural, conveys the intermingling effects of change that move back and forth across relational webs when caregivers respect care seekers and care seekers in turn trust caregivers. I would like to suggest that this process of change begins with the essential ingredients of compassionate respect and trust. This combination has a leavening effect, making possible intersubjective spaces for meaning-making and life-giving ways of connecting with each other, God, and the sacred dimensions of life. The goals of pastoral and spiritual care. The goals of pastoral and spiritual care depend on the context of care. As historical overviews of pastoral care illustrate, goals are varied and shaped by many cultural, historical, and religious factors. Such goals also reflect systems of social privilege and advantage, and what counts for knowledge, religious, psychological, and medical. For example, the goal of healing has been at the heart of the clinical paradigm of pastoral care that evolved in the 20th century, when theologically liberal pastoral caregivers and theologians embraced existential psychology and psychotherapies. The goal of individual healing is appealing in part because it puts into practice many modern, middle-class Euro-American values: personal autonomy, individual freedom, and a belief in progress, along with a non-moralistic use of religion that focuses on self-actualization and personal growth. During the 1960s, more theologically conservative Protestant pastoral caregivers retrieved a long-standing historical, classical clerical paradigm of pastoral care, whose goal of guiding focused on the authority of the Bible, a personal commitment to Jesus Christ, and belief in fundamental creedal statements. Challenges to the goal of healing also emerged from theologically progressive pastoral caregivers beginning in the 1980s. Moving beyond the liberal moral sensibility that gave rise to the goal of healing, these voices pushed the practice of pastoral care in new directions. African American pastoral theologians questioned the ways in which the goal of healing reflected Euro-American middle-class perspectives on personal development and growth that depended upon long-term, one-on-one counseling relationships. Wimberly proposed the goal of sustaining as more contextually meaningful for Black congregations, offering communal care that supported people whose healing could not be fully realized in racist social systems. In similar ways, feminist pastoral theologians and caregivers valued the ways in which women's experiences as both caregivers and care receivers challenged traditional male-oriented approaches to human development and practices of care. They offered contextual goals that valued women's experiences and approaches to care. Womanist pastoral caregivers proposed goals like survival as more congruent with African American women's experiences of intersecting gender, class, and racial oppression. The need for contextual goals that take into account social systems of privilege became even more important within a global horizon where the varieties of pastoral and spiritual care, with their indigenous practices and contextual theologies, were valued as distinctively unique. Such contextual theologies were often suppressed when Western models of care were imposed. While acknowledging the need for contextually appropriate goals that promote social justice, I would like to propose that such goals be considered in tandem with a goal of liberative integration or integrative liberation, when such pairings fit the context of care. As I will elaborate, the intertwined goals of liberation and integration are closely tied with distinctive features of a narrative and embodied approach to intercultural care, namely, its focus on compassionately entering into the stories of care seekers and listening for how these stories are shaped by family and cultural narratives that afford or deny privileges. Compassion-based spiritual care helps care seekers tenderly understand how their emotional reactions of shame, fear, guilt, and anger, formed in childhood by family and social systems, have accompanying embodied theologies, values, beliefs, and ways of coping constellated and held together by these emotions. Integrative liberation becomes embodied when compassion envelops life-limiting theologies of fear and shame automatically triggered under stress for persons, families, and communities. Liberative integration is sustained by ongoing spiritual practices, personal and communal, along with theological awareness of when personal and cultural values, beliefs, and coping practices are life-limiting. Under stress, many care seekers are influenced by and act upon embedded formative values, beliefs, and ways of coping that may no longer be spiritually life-giving and may generate chronic spiritual struggle. Exploring and aligning values, beliefs, and spiritual practices will make room for a more complex integration of religious or spiritual worlds that can compassionately respond to suffering, one's own and the world's. Such integration is liberative in that it holds persons, families, and communities accountable for living out their values and beliefs, as well as practicing their faith in ways that reach out to those in pain and seek justice. I am using the term liberative to refer broadly to theological reflexivity and praxis focused on social oppression and justice from any religious tradition. This systemic understanding of liberative integration and justice means that at its core, pastoral care is political. The link between the personal and the political is in the DNA of caregiving. Caregivers bring their theological formation, education, and training to the collaborative work of exploring the religious and spiritual worlds of persons, families, and organizations. In paying attention to how formative stories point to core values, ultimate beliefs, and spiritual practices, pastoral caregivers balance their narrative knowledge of care seekers with theological knowledge about when beliefs, values, and coping are most likely to be life-giving or life-limiting. Such theological assessment, used alongside psychological, family systems, and organizational knowledge of religious coping and social oppression, is what makes this narrative intercultural approach to spiritual care distinct from psychological and medical care. Collaboratively exploring embedded beliefs, values, and ways of coping, connecting with the sacred, can feel like venturing into places in care seekers' religious or spiritual homes that are historically in the past, but still exerting an influence, especially under stress. Stress-related feelings of fear, shame, and guilt pull together values, beliefs, and ways of coping that are embodied life-limiting theologies formed by systems of social oppression. Compassion brings these embedded beliefs, values, and coping practices out of the shadows, fostering spiritual integration as these life-limiting body theologies are tenderly acknowledged and understood. Such explorations of bodily felt theologies may enhance an appreciation for the mystery of life and the world, both the immanent mystery of particular stories and an overarching transcendent sense of mystery about life itself. Spiritual integration of beliefs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?